BBC Radio 3, it's time for Belief. Here's Joan Bakewell.
Here to talk about his belief is a scientist whose new book, The Science Delusion, attacks what he calls the 10 dogmas of modern science. He's at odds with what he believes is the constricting materialism of mainstream science today. He is biologist Dr. Ρούπερτ Σέλντρεϊκ, who enjoyed a glittering academic career in Cambridge and Harvard, becoming Director of Studies in Biochemistry and Cell Biology at Clare College, Cambridge. In the 1960s he spent a year in Malaysia studying rainforest plants, then moved to Hyderabad in 1974, where for 11 years he was Principal Plant Physiologist at the International Crops Research Institute. While in India he underwent a major shift in his outlook, living for over a year in the Christian ashram of Father Bede Griffiths. It was there he wrote his first book, A New Science of Life, in which he expounded his theory of morphic resonance, an idea that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. Indeed, the distinguished former editor of Nature, John Maddox, called it a book for burning. Other books followed, including Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and The Sense of Being Stared At, giving further scope to his ideas about morphic resonance and what we call telepathy. Until last year he was director of the Parrot Warwick Project at Trinity College, Cambridge, and is visiting professor at the Graduate Institute in Connecticut. Dr. Sheldrake, your theories and writing have outraged the scientific community, which you yourself remember. So how does that affect your beliefs? Do beliefs and science run in parallel?
Well, they're closely related, and people often use the word belief in relation to religious belief, but what I come up against all the time is scientific belief, which in many cases is more dogmatic than the beliefs I encounter among religious believers, particularly members of the Church of England.
Well, that's why I particularly didn't say religious beliefs, because it is what you attack in science is what you believe simply to be their beliefs.
Yes.
As though they were a religion.
That's right. I mean, I think the problem in science is that a lot of assumptions that were reasonable assumptions when they were first made have hardened into dogmas. And most scientists who believe these dogmas don't even realize they're believing something. They just think it's the truth. And that's a dangerous position, you see. And my questioning of these beliefs is applying the skeptical principle to some of the foundational beliefs of science, because I think it's good for science to do that. I think it opens up science and in every case leads to a wider view and new possible experiments.
Well, questioning is never wrong. Let's look at your own background. You were born into a Methodist family. Grandfather played the organ. And
yes.
You enjoyed that. You were part of that.
Oh, very much so. I was brought up in Newark in Nottinghamshire. My family were Methodists on both sides. My grandfather was the organist and the choirmaster, and my uncle succeeded him. I liked that very much. I was brought up in a world of music. People sang in my home. You know, we used to sing together as a family. I learned the piano and then the organ.
And then you were sent away to a boarding school that was high Anglican. This is quite a shift.
That was a shift, but it still retained the singing element. I was in the school choir, and I learned the organ there. And I actually really liked the high Anglican services with lots of candles and bells and that kind of thing. I found really quite attractive.
Was it meaningful in a religious sense?
Well, it was, I suppose, at the beginning, and then by the age of 12 or 13, as part of my scientific interest, because I was very interested in science, I began to absorb the standard issue scientific worldview, which includes a kind of materialist attitude and atheist belief system. So I would say by the age of about 14, I considered myself an atheist. I was the only boy in the school that refused to get confirmed.
That must have been quite troubling for your family.
Well, they were Methodists, so they weren't that concerned about not being confirmed in the Church of England. That wasn't altogether troubling for them. The atheism, I think, was troubling.
And your resistance to being confirmed must have made you a rather conspicuous pupil.
I think I was a thorn in the flesh of the school chaplain. But, you know, he and I actually quite enjoyed arguing with each other. I suppose he'd seen it all before, so he took it in his stride.
But your science teacher was very behind you, indeed pressed forward this idea.
Oh yes, particularly my biology teacher, who was called Robin Thoday. He was a wonderful teacher, a great biologist. He really set me out on a path of biology that I've followed ever since. he wasn't a kind of militant, shrill atheist. He was a fairly sophisticated one. He came from a Quaker background, and he gave me books like The Golden Bough to read, and Freud, Totem and Taboo, and things like that. So by the time I was about 17, I had this view of religion as a primitive belief system, science as something that superseded it utterly, and a pretty standard atheist view of the world.
And was that endorsed when you went to Cambridge and Harvard?
Oh, yes, taken for granted. I mean, in the culture of science in Cambridge when I was there, probably still today, it was just taken for granted that scientists are atheists, and any believer in religion was regarded as feeble-minded, or at least as somebody who'd sealed off part of themselves from the world of reason.
And what did you make of that at the time?
I rather accepted that. I thought that was the only way to see the world.
And then you went to India. Well, you went to Malaysia first of all, and basically
Yes.
you went into the East and began to absorb a whole different worldview.
Yes, exactly. I mean, when I went to Malaysia in 1968, I travelled through India. I spent 3 months there, in India and Sri Lanka. And that, for me, was a fantastic revelation. I mean, here were people with a completely different view of the world, who took seriously sacred places, pilgrimage, meditation, other states of mind, yoga. It was just a completely different worldview, and it was in many ways much more attractive than what began to seem rather threadbare and shallow, the atheist view I'd had before.
How did you come to go to this Christian ashram?
Well, the first step for me was starting to meditate, which I did about 1971, and I started using the Maharishi method, transcendental meditation. What was appealing about that was that the argument was that you can just do this, experience this, and you don't have to believe anything, you just rely on your experience. That was very attractive to me, because I didn't want to have to sign up to a package of beliefs. So I did that, and I started doing yoga. And then I was doing that in India. And I was very interested in Indian teachers. I used to go to discourses on the Upanishads and that sort of thing, and visited temples. But after a while I realized that however hard I tried, I couldn't be a Hindu, because I'm not an Indian. And it's very much specific to India, the sacred places of Hinduism. And I found myself just being drawn back towards a Christian path. It was not at all what I'd expected going to India. Then the problem was, how do I fit a kind of Christian path with all these very important insights that I think Hinduism had to offer, and Buddhism? And that's when I met Father Bede Griffiths, who'd been living in India for years, an English Benedictine monk in a small ashram in South India.
Now tell me about him, because his influence has been quite important.
Yes, well, he started off when he was at Oxford as a kind of atheist or agnostic. He then was under the influence partly of his tutor C.S. Lewis, became interested in the Christian tradition. Then he became a Benedictine monk in England. Then after a while he felt that somehow the English tradition, the Christian tradition, had somehow not exactly lost touch with, but a bit estranged from its mystical roots. His point was that the core of all religion is mystical experience, a direct experience of a greater consciousness than our own. And he thought that living in India would be a good way to try and find out more about that in other traditions, because he believed that this experience is the core of all religions, and then in each religion it's packaged in the forms of that culture and the traditions of that culture, but the core is beyond these separate cultures.
So in your going to live with him, you were there for over a year. Did you begin to take on for yourself that belief in the beyond, the transcendental nature of reality?
Well, I wouldn't call it a belief, I'd call it an experience, because when I was meditating, and on various occasions, I had experiences of being part of a much greater whole, part of a greater presence.
But isn't that just a clever brain under chemical influence?
Well, perhaps, but perhaps not. You see, the assumption that it's just a clever brain under chemical influence induced by meditation or breathing techniques, that's one possible explanation. Of course, I was interested in that, but that might be more plausible if science had a wonderful understanding of the nature of the mind. In fact, it doesn't. The biggest gap in the scientific worldview is understanding consciousness and the mind. So on the scientific side, there's a rather thin assumption that it's all nothing but the brain, and when you really look at that assumption, as I do in my book, The Science Delusion, it turns out that it's not actually very well justified. Of course, the brain's got something to do with it. But more plausible, certainly if you've had the experience, is the possibility there are forms of consciousness beyond the human level, and we can indeed contact them through prayer and meditation. And that, I believe, is what lies at the heart of all religions.
Did you have conversations with Father Bede along these lines? Was he your guide?
Yes, I had conversations with him almost every day, and I found I could talk to him about almost anything I was interested in, and he was immensely helpful to talk to.
So he was leading you towards an integration of Eastern and Western thinking?
Yes.
Without throwing out any of it?
No, that's right. He didn't throw out any of it, and in the services at Shantivanam, in the chapel in the ashram, which was shaped like a temple, and Father Bede wore orange robes like a Hindu holy man, we started with the Gayatri mantra, which is a Sanskrit mantra to the sun, and we had Tamil devotional singing, and so we had all these things that were taken from the Indian tradition, integrated with the Christian services. And I said to him, I don't understand how you can have all these Hindu things in a Catholic ashram. And he said, well, that's because it's Catholic. He said, Catholic means universal, and if it excluded anything, a value, and it comes through of divine inspiration, it wouldn't be Catholic. One of the things I so liked about India was the way that Indians had a sense of sacred place and time, that there are pilgrimages to holy places, and Indians take them very seriously. They have fun as well. Pilgrimages are fun. They don't go on tourist holidays. They go on pilgrimages. When I got back to England, I realized that all this was here under my very nose. You know, the great sacred places of England, we have pre-Christian ones like Avebury, but we also have the Christian ones, our cathedrals and churches, many of them built on pre-Christian sites, holy places, sacred sites.
And the parish churches.
And parish churches.
T.S. Eliot and
exactly.
Philip Larkin, everybody kind of isn't aware of these places. Is that because people have been there in these sacred places forever?
I think so. I mean, certainly for centuries in many of them, people have prayed there, they've been married there, funerals have happened there, babies have been christened there. It's been a focus of the connection of a community with another world, with the heavens and with the earth. Churches are places like Hindu temples that link the heavens and the earth. And I think that at the centre of each community, having a sacred place where people from the community can join together and sing and celebrate and give thanks is just a wonderful thing. And I rediscovered the value of this really when I came back to England from India.
So you returned to celebrate your Anglicanism. Did you ever get confirmed?
Yes, I was confirmed in the Church of South India, which is an ecumenical Anglican Methodist church, so that fitted quite well with my Methodist and Anglican roots.
And how much of Anglicanism did you take on board? I mean, to go to the religious narrative, Christ, the Son of God, death, resurrection, the Trinity, eternal life?
Oh yes, I dare say I interpret them in a way that might be different from other people, but for me the most important doctrine in the Christian Church is the Holy Trinity, because this is a doctrine about the nature of the divine being, and what it tells us is that God is not a single person. The divine mind is a complex organism with three parts, interacting parts. And I see the key feature of the Trinity as the word and the breath. I mean, the Spirit is the breath. So the key metaphor is the spoken word. If I have words in my mind with no breath, they're silent and do nothing. If I have breath, I just breathe out with no words. But the two together are what cause change in the world, and I think these are the underlying principles of nature. Breath or energy is the flow of things in all nature, and the words are like the forms, the fields that shape everything in nature. So I see nature as a reflection of the Holy Trinity.
The Church of England is a very broad church. There might have been a time when the Catholic Church might have felt what you were just expounding there quite heretical, but you hadn't been regarded as a heretic within the Anglican communion.
No. Actually, I don't think that exposition is heretical, because I mean the Spirit means breath, the word is the second person of the Trinity. This, I think, is the primary metaphor, not a heretical view.
For the resurrection of Christ?
Well,
God's intervention in human history?
Oh, I think God interacts with history, and my view of God is not a kind of engineering God who fine-tunes the laws of nature and presses the start button for the Big Bang. I think that kind of deistic view of God is very implausible and not very interesting, and certainly not the kind of God you'd want to pray to. No, I think God's interactive, and I think God interacts with history at the very least through human beings. If people pray to God and feel they're getting messages or insights or inspiration from God, it changes the way they act. And the whole of Western history is shaped by people who've worked in accordance with what they think is the will of God. It's shaped our whole history.
Where does your observance take place now? Is it every church, Catholic Church, the Quaker tradition?
Oh no, I usually go to our local parish church. I'm a member of it. When I travel, I try and go to church wherever I am. Recently I was in France. I was in Lyon, so I went to the cathedral for Mass, and it was a most wonderful experience. They had a wonderful choir. There was a very good French film called Les Choristes about children's singers, a children's choir, and they're from Lyon. And so I actually heard this kind of singing in a liturgical setting. It was a most beautiful service.
Music has been a thread through all your conversation.
Yes.
And I wondered whether, this is an angelic choir. Do you believe in the concept of angels?
I wrote a book on angels with a theologian called Matthew Fox. It's called The Physics of Angels. And I don't believe angels are beings with wings that look like slightly epicene.
Botticelli.
Yes, I don't think they're like that. I think that it's a word that's used to talk about forms of consciousness beyond the human level. And some forms of religion take the view that the human beings are conscious, God's conscious, but there's nothing in between. There's a kind of void. But that's not traditional Christianity, Judaism or Islam or Hinduism. All religions have had the idea there's many, many levels of conscious being. And in the Middle Ages, one of the levels of angels were the celestial angels, who were the intelligences of the stars and planets. And I think, this is certainly heretical scientifically, that the sun is conscious and that the galaxy is conscious, and that the traditional way of thinking about these forms of consciousness beyond the human level was in terms of angelic minds.
The sun is conscious? What does that mean?
Most people, even materialists, assume that the interface between our brains and our minds is the electromagnetic activity of the brain. The sun has much more complex electromagnetic patterns than our brains. And what if those are an interface with the mind of the sun? What if the sun is a conscious being? All traditions have seen it that way. The Indians speak of Surya, the sun god. The Greeks had Apollo. Children, when they draw the sun, give it a smiley face. It's a mere assumption in science that the sun is a kind of giant hydrogen bomb with absolutely no consciousness.
But there's a considerable proof that it is hydrogen, and also there's a sense in which people's thinking is we've moved on from the child's smiley sun, and there's been something called progress in which we have pinned down reality.
Well, that's what I call the science delusion. The belief we've pinned down reality, that we've basically got the basic answers in principle, leaving only the details to be filled in, I think is a profoundly mistaken view. And I think it's arrogant, because it dismisses all previous human thought as childish delusion, and regards this as the ultimate truth. If science had a wonderful explanation for human minds and consciousness in general, and for many of the other things that it purports to understand, including heredity, I might be convinced. But I don't think it does. I think it has a series of really unthought-out dogmatic beliefs. Most scientists just accept these things without question. When you're educated as a scientist, you aren't told, here's an assumption, now let's look at the reasons for it and against it and discuss it. It's just taken for granted. Matter is unconscious. That's just an assumption. So the sun's unconscious. Why even discuss it? So you see, I think this kind of attitude, ruling out whole questions which I think do fall within the scope of science, is, apart from anything else, boring. It's just constrict science and scientific discussion.
Tell me about morphic resonance.
Morphic resonance is a memory principle in nature, and it's the doctrine, the idea, is that similar things influence subsequent similar things across space and time. So a baby giraffe, as it grows, because it's already a giraffe, because it's got giraffe genes and giraffe proteins, resonates with previous giraffes and picks up the influence of their form, which shapes its growth, and then its instincts which shape its behaviour.
That's genetics, isn't it?
No, well, the thing is, we know what genes do. The thing is, in the modern world, most people equate the word hereditary with genetic, assuming that genes cover all heredity. We actually know what genes do. They code for the structure of proteins. So once you've got the right protein, or at least the right sequence of amino acids, that's where the genetic explanation ends. So, you know, your arm and your legs have the same proteins, the same genes, yet different shapes. Within biology, it's simply not possible to explain form and instinct just in terms of genes and proteins, which is why biologists use concepts like morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields. It's a mainstream concept in developmental biology, and I'm saying that these fields have a kind of memory within them.
Its use of the word memory, I think, that perhaps brought down the scientific community on your head, because they perhaps felt that memory was something specific to the brain, recalling things. What you're saying is that everything has a memory.
Yes.
That is more than its genetic code. That is.
Yes.
What is it?
Well, it's this resonance from the past. It's this resonance from the past. You see, most memory is unconscious. Even most of your memory and my memory is unconscious. So memory doesn't imply consciousness. Habits are a kind of memory. And what I'm saying is that most of the memory in nature is habitual. The subtitle of my book, The Presence of the Past, is Morphic Resonance and the Habits of Nature. I'm saying that nature has habits, whereas my opponents and scientific colleagues are saying that nature is governed by fixed laws that were all there at the moment of the Big Bang. And this is an assumption, the idea there's a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code. We can't prove it. It's just simply a carryover from an old cosmology, a Greek cosmology, which thought that the ultimate reality was eternal.
And where does this link with telepathy? And where does this link with telepathy?
Well, telepathy is a somewhat slightly different process. It's not exactly morphic resonance. It's members of social groups are linked through what I call morphic fields. When someone forms a bond with their dog or with their children or their lovers or their friends, I think this bond is a kind of field, a social field that includes the different individuals within it. When people move apart, the field, as it were, stretches and continues to connect them, and can act as a medium of communication, which I think is the basis of telepathy. So telepathy, I believe, happens between closely linked or bonded individuals, and it's mainly to do with needs, pain, distress, things like that. It's not basically a method of downloading huge amounts of information.
Now, your critics say that the evidence for this that you offer is merely anecdotal and that it's not possible to prove this theory, and indeed they've called it magical thinking.
Yes, well, you see, the problem with dealing with critics like that is that they're profoundly arrogant and ignorant. I've published dozens of papers, and so have other people, on telepathy. I've done many studies on telephone telepathy, the phenomenon whereby you think of someone who then rings and you say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." That starts as anecdotes. 80% of people have those experiences, according to my surveys. But the whole point of my research is to look at what people say. You start with anecdotes, that gives you the natural history. Then move on to experimental tests. And the telephone telepathy tests are statistical, highly significant, and they've been repeated and replicated. And what's more, I now have an automated version on my website that anyone can do for themselves. So when critics say, it's only anecdotal, it's not replicated, it's because they haven't taken the trouble to look at the data. And the biggest problem I have with skeptics of telepathy is a dogmatic belief that it's impossible. Therefore, all the evidence must be flawed or fraudulent. This is one of the problems I'm talking about, scientific dogma. I encounter it on a daily basis. But the evidence is there.
The evidence that something happens, I accept what you say, but what we haven't got, have we, is what is going on between the person who is separated from someone they're close to, what is winging through the atmosphere? What is happening? Is it atoms? Are we into electricity? Where are we?
Oh, I don't think it's either atoms or electricity. I think it happens through what I call morphic fields. But, you know, that's just my theory. You see, there's two levels here. First of all, does telepathy happen? And I think that experiments with dogs and cats, dogs knowing when their owners are coming home, which I've done many experiments on, animals picking up people's thoughts, people knowing who's going to ring, these kinds of experiments show that it happens. Now then the question is, how do you explain it? I have a theory to explain it. There are other theories to explain it. One of my colleagues, Dean Radin, thinks that minds are entangled in the same way that quantum particles are entangled through interaction, and when people whose minds have interacted move apart, they remain connected in some way, analogous to quantum physics. Well, I myself don't push that quantum theory explanation because I think it's extrapolating too much from the realm of the microscopic, but it may be in the end his explanation and mine turn out to be variants on the same theory.
Are you telepathic?
Not particularly. I mean, I'm sometimes telepathic, especially with my children, but I'm not particularly gifted. I score mildly above chance in my own experiments, but I'm not one of the star subjects.
Can you teach yourself telepathy? Can you improve this quality, whatever it is?
I think so, yes, and one way I encourage people to try and teach themselves is to do my telephone telepathy test, which will give them a score as to their level of telepathic ability. Then sort of work on their intuition by paying attention to it, practicing guessing who's phoning and that kind of thing, and then do the test again, and they should be able to have objective evidence for any improvement.
Now, your new book, The Science Delusion, comes out fighting against the prevailing scientific community, really. What is it you deplore about them? Because they are, on the whole, of mixed beliefs. I've interviewed a great many who are also religious people.
Yes.
Some are atheists, but science is an open mind, they tell me, and experiments and theories have to be put to the test, be replicable, and always tested. What's wrong with that?
Nothing's wrong with that. That's what I'm in favour of. That's exactly what I'm arguing for. But you see, what I'd argue is that there's a huge gulf between this ideal of scientific openness, objectivity, attention to evidence, and scientific practice, which is a sort of narrow, dogmatic atmosphere. Within science labs, for example, if someone has a telepathic experience, or thinks they have, most of them would never mention it to their friends or colleagues in the science lab because they know it would meet with instant scornful rejection. But in private, you know, after a glass or two of wine, with friends or family, they'd be quite prepared to talk about it. So my point is, a lot of scientists think that science as it's presently practiced is too narrow, too dogmatic and constricted. But privately they think that. But in public, there's a kind of collective mentality where you can't rock the boat or challenge these assumptions. I want scientists to come out and say what they really think. And that would include atheists saying that they're really atheists, but it would also include people who think they've had telepathic experiences feeling free to talk about them and do research on them.
So how does this impact on your beliefs, your faith, your religion? I hesitate to use these words because in a sense you've transformed them.
Well, for example, morphic resonance is the principle. Similar things resonate across time. So look at religious rituals. All religions have rituals, and all secular groups have rituals, like the American Thanksgiving dinner. It's a national ritual. So when I take part in Christian rituals, like Holy Communion, or the festivals, like the Day of the Dead, All Souls Day, these seasonal festivals and rituals involve doing things the way they've been done before, more or less, and that, I think, tunes in the present participants by morphic resonance with those who've done them before. There's a presence of the past, a connection across time. And the role rituals play is by incorporating present participants with their own community in the present, but also with those who went before and those who will come after.
And you enjoy that when you go to church, when you take communion, when you sing hymns?
Yes.
When you're part of it?
Yes, definitely.
Ρούπερτ Σέλντρεϊκ, thank you very much.
Joan Bakewell's guest on Belief this evening was Professor Ρούπερτ Σέλντρεϊκ, and you can hear this and other programs from the series again via the Radio 3 website.